Hi, this is David Hawks with Agile Velocity, and today I would like to share with you a framework that we've developed called Path to Agility to help you navigate your Agile transformation. What we've done is taken a couple concepts from organizational change models and apply that to patterns that we've observed throughout Agile adoptions, transitions, transformations that we've experienced. Now, the first premise is that when we start at status quo and introduce change, we always get worse before we get better. And this is a natural human reaction that when we go from status quo and this point that we introduce change, we enter a period of what we call chaos and resistance. This is, the reaction we have because we knew how to play by the old rules in the status quo, but then when we get this change that happens, it could be an organizational change, a role change, a leadership change, it could be something in our personal lives that's changed. We knew how to win by the old rules. We don't really understand the new rules, so we don't know if we're going to be able to win in these new rules. We don't know if we will be a hero in these new rules, and maybe we were a hero before. So it's okay and natural for people to freak out and kind of try and struggle through that. And as leaders, we need to make sure that we are supporting this change and addressing this tension and stress that may appear. We also then, after that, once we kind of get to the bottom of this, we kind of figure out these new rules, but we're not good at them. We still suck at these new rules, and we need to go through a period of what we call integration and practice to start getting good at those new rules and hopefully achieving this new status quo. So we're hopefully getting to a new, better state. Now, we know we've probably all been a part of a change initiative that introduced a change and just never got better, or one that introduced a change and said, well, that's not working, let's introduce another change, and maybe have this kind of downward death spiral of change. But what we want to make sure is that we are introducing these and hopefully getting better. And the reality is we should have a series of these J curves kind of going on and making incremental improvements as we go. Now, what we find is the value of working with coaches or others is that what we really can bring to the table is that we're helping organizations accelerate through this change and reduce the risk of how deep they'll go. And we find that Path to Agility is a way that can help you kind of navigate those choppy waters, if you will. So what we've done is we've said, let's look at the stages of kind of agility that we go through as we're introducing change in our organization. So the first stage that we see that we need to look at is what we call align. Now, align and each of these stages kind of have an applicable level of something we might do at the organizational level or at the team level. And so we're going to explore each of those together. So what happens at the org, what happens at the team. Now, alignment starts with what we call, ask the question, why? Why are we making this change? And we see too many organizations that say, like, they're implementing Agile to be more Agile. Well, that's not really a great goal, right? How will you measure that you're Agile enough? How will you know that you've succeeded? So what we really want to make sure is that we focus with leadership on creating a clear and compelling vision that is around the strategic objectives of the company. What is it why do we want to be Agile? Agile's a solution. It might be the right solution. It might not be. And we want to make sure we're focused on, is it that we need to have faster time to market and be better reactionary to what the market demands are so that we can beat the competition, right? If we're going to ask people to go through this change, which is going to force us to go through this period of chaos and resistance, a stressful time, then people got to be motivated to get to this new status quo. So we need some compelling vision so that everybody is seeking to get to that state, right? We don't want to seek to get to a state of better agility. We want to get to a state of accomplishing some goal. So the first question we want to ask is, why are we making the change? The second thing we want to ask and get aligned around is, how are we going to introduce this change? Are we going to introduce it across the whole company at once? Are we going to introduce it with a pilot? Who's going to lead this change, right? So we talk a lot about forming an agile leadership team that is cross-functional, that's going to remove impediments quickly across the organization, who's going to drive change and make sure it stays top of mind and is a priority, who's going to celebrate the wins and do good PR across the organization. And then we also want to align around making sure we're in a state of readiness, right? Are we actually ready to start this change? So do we have people identified to take on like Scrum Master role and Product Owner role if we're going to be doing Scrum? Do we have the right organizational structure in terms of the teams and how we're aligned around that? So we want to ask those questions. And then at a team level, we want to ask questions like, does the team have a clear purpose? Do they know what they're focused on? Do they have a vision? Is it aligned with a customer and delivering value? Or is it just like we're a database team that builds database tables? Well, that's not a real clear value purpose. We also want to make sure that teams are clear around their team agreements on how are they going to work. Are they going to focus on, are they doing Scrum or Kanban? What does that mean to them? Just even how are they going to hold each other accountable? How are they going to have healthy conflict? Do they have clear definitions of done and definition of ready potentially? What are the team agreements, and is the team aligned around their mission and what they're all about and how they're going to work together to achieve that? So that's where we want to start. And so I want you to think about, like, is your company aligned? Many companies have started doing Agile and they didn't really have good alignment around why. And so that might be something that you want to go back and kind of clean up a little bit. So the second stage of Path to Agility is what we call Learn. So Learn has two kind of core elements. Part of it is about knowledge and getting the knowledge. We see that many organizations have people that have all come from different companies that have some Agile experience, maybe Wagile or Scrum or Fall or different types and different flavors, but they're not necessarily all aligned around the same terminology and the same expectations. So one thing we want to make sure that teams are doing is we call it establishing foundational practices. So if we're doing Scrum, are we actually having retros? Are we doing backlog refinement? Do we have a clear backlog? So are we getting visibility into all of the work that the team is doing? So is it on a board? Is it in a tool? Do we have visibility? Do we know what everybody's working on? Can we start identifying where the bottlenecks are? If we can't see it, we can't measure it, and we won't be able to improve it. So the real element of Learn is creating what we call a continuous improvement culture. So are we creating a culture where the teams are taking ownership and they're trying to get better, and that they feel empowered to do that, right? So when we look at that and think about that, there's definitely a leadership component to that. So in order to kind of empower these teams, right, so we're transferring ownership to the teams, we also got to do things like, are we creating a safe to fail environment? So is this a culture that is allowing and actually encouraging folks to try new things and take risks to figure out how to improve? Or is it a culture of fear, right? So now what really has to happen at the learning stage is we need to start developing what we call a agile leaders or agile leadership mindset, right? So more servant leadership versus command and control. How do we start distributing ownership and decision making down to the teams that are these cross-functional, empowered teams to get things done? And And the third thing is that we want to make sure that we are deliberate about how we are facilitating the change, right? So how, and this kind of feeds from that ALT that we mentioned earlier. So how are we managing the change? How are we facilitating? So do we have an impediment board? What we encourage our ALTs to do is work with Agile, right? Use Scrum to manage the transformation. So build a backlog, prioritize it, have daily scrums, make your work visible in a place where everybody can see, have your stand-ups where everybody can see. So then what it shows and demonstrates to the team level is like, hey, our leadership team is doing this too. And they are taking ownership. And then as they escalate impediments, those go on that board, and it's visible that, hey, where is it getting prioritized and are they working on it? Because the fastest way to kind of, I call it empower the resistance, is for leadership to not take action, right? So if the team escalates an issue and it goes to leadership and they don't resolve it quickly, then the signal you're sending back to your team level is that leadership doesn't find it important. And so at that point, they're saying, well, then Agile's not very important, and we just will give up and not try to make it better, right? So we really need the leadership team to get involved and to start demonstrating that they really want to lead this change and be part of the change. We talked to leaders about changing some of their questions from, instead of, what's the date and what's going to be in it and kind of driving the team, we want leaders at this stage to change their questions to, what are y'all learning and how can I help? Right? So what are you learning encourages teams to take chances, to improve, to have that continuous improvement culture. And the how can I help is starting to enforce that servant leadership. I'm here to help. I'm not here to drive. I'm not here to make the decisions for you. I'm here to pave the way for things to run smoothly. So that's the learn stage. Then we get into what we call predict. So what we want to get to in this predict stage is we want our teams to start establishing a predictable cadence of delivery. So are we actually getting things done? Are they potentially shippable every sprint? In order to get potentially shippable, teams need to start developing skills around swarming instead of working in silos. They need to learn how to break work down. But we really want teams where they're not carrying over anything from one sprint to the next. So when we talk about predict, we're not talking about we can predict exactly what we're going to deliver 6 months from now, because things will change. But what we do want to have is a predictable cadence that we know we can deliver, say, 10 things every 2 weeks. We don't know what 10 things we're going to deliver 8 weeks from now, but we can forecast if we have a predictable cadence that based on the things that are on our list right now, here's what we might be able to deliver in 8 weeks. But if things change, then we will reserve the right and work with the customer and the business to decide if we want to change those priorities around. So establishing that predictable cadence of delivery and really focusing on what we call shortening the feedback loop, but more specifically the quality feedback loop. So we want to really get the feedback loop of quality shortened. So dev and QA working closer together, the whole team owning quality, developers starting to engage in things like unit testing and test-driven development, us establishing continuous integration environments so that we're able to if we're not testing early and often, then we're deferring a lot of unknown bugs that we'll find later, which will impact our ability to predict, right? Because that means we're not getting to known good quality states every few weeks or every sprint if we're doing Scrum. At an organizational level and a leadership level, one of the key things that the teams need in order to get to this predictable cadence is they need focus. They need clear priorities. And so what that means is that we are doing things like limiting WIP, limiting work in process. How many things is the organization trying to get done at one time? There's lots of studies that show, multitasking. If we try and do lots of stuff, we're working on lots of things, but we're not getting anything done. We have this saying in Agile about, stop starting and start finishing. So let's focus on finishing and getting things done, and then that leads to that predictable cadence, and then we're going to be able to tune from there. It also, for focus, means creating more of a pull versus push environment. I love Hendrik's analogy in his video where he talks about, most organizations are trying to shove more paper in the printer and trying to get it to go faster by shoving more paper into it. And the reality is it just clogs up the system. So what we want to focus on as leaders is, are we making the hard decisions so that our teams can pull in work and focus on it and get things done, and shorten kind of even the time to value across our organization. So the other thing that we're focused on as a leadership team, and even at ALT level, is, are we reducing complexity in terms of how our teams are structured, in terms of things like dependencies across teams. So in Agile, what we really want to do is we talk a lot about feature teams and trying to reduce the number of dependencies and put them kind of within the team. How can we reduce some of this complexity and chaos and add more discipline into our organization? And we're not changing our minds all the time, those kinds of things. So we want to attack those sources of volatility as an organization and try and limit those so that the teams can be focused and get things done. Now, the fourth stage is what we call accelerate. Now, many organizations, when we talk to them, they say the number one reason why they're adopting Agile is because they want to get faster. And so you might ask, why is that the fourth thing on the list? Well, what we find is, if we have a team that's not very predictable and we ask them to go faster, we're just going to be kind of all over the place, right? So what we need to do is, if we have a team that's not very predictable, we need to get more predictable, and then we can tune what we can measure, right? If we can't measure it and we just have a noisy system, when we change something, we don't know if it's making a positive impact or a negative impact, right? So we got to get predictable before we can get faster, because we can tune something that we can measure, that we can see, that is repeatable. So when we get into accelerate, we start talking about, we call it optimize the whole. So optimizing the whole value stream from the time that, concept to cash. So from the time an idea comes in to the time that it gets out the door. So up and through predict, a lot of what we've been focused on is optimizing the delivery within the team, and maybe within a sprint or a couple sprints. Accelerate is starting to focus on what's happening upstream, all the planning, the prioritization, the funding, portfolio level stuff that's happening. How can we optimize and shorten that time? What happens downstream? What happens after a sprint? How many do we have to wait on user acceptance testing? Do we have a late regression cycle? How long does it take until we get to the next deployment window, right? So how do we optimize the whole? And this becomes, for leadership, this is where a lot of peer level leaders have to learn new skills about how do they work together as a team to resolve organizational issues and lead organizational change. And so part of what we see also at an organizational level is, this is when we start seeing that we can start developing more of internal coaching capacity. And some of this can come from the Scrum Masters that were involved in the earlier stages. So in the earlier stages, the Scrum Masters tend to be very team focused because the issues are within the team. The team's learning a lot of things. But as the teams get more self-organizing and the teams start getting better, then the Scrum Master's focus isn't as required internally, but what the teams need them to do is help resolve some of the organizational challenges. And so at this stage, this is where some of those Scrum Masters can start becoming more coaching across the organization and with those leaders and helping the managers and directors and VPs across organizational units start determining, okay, how can they optimize the whole, right, the whole system. Now at a team level, the things that we start to see happening here is more of a focus on releasing continuously. So this is where like things like DevOps come into play. So in Predict, we focused on continuous integration. Here, we would be focused more on continuous delivery and continuous deployment. How can we automate that, all the way into operations? Now, this also may require looking at your architecture and your tech stack, and do we have the tools and the environment in order to do that? So how can we start creating and getting those assets in place where we can start releasing on demand, and so we have teams that we're working with that are release by the end of the sprint. They release everything into production. Now it might be toggled off. They might not have all of that exposed to their customer base, but they are integrating and continuously releasing their code. And so the emphasis of the team starts to become, how do we reduce cycle time? So while the key measure in Predict may be trying to get a consistent velocity, now at Accelerate, a key measure would be for us to start looking at what's our cycle time from the time we get an idea to the time it's in production. How do we start optimizing that? And that starts creating really neat behaviors within the team of people less focused on themselves, more focused on the team, more focused on collaboration, more focused on automation, and things like that. So now we're delivering fast, but we have this stat in our industry, the software industry, that says 64% of the things that we build are rarely or never used. So at the last stage here, Adapt is starting to say, all right, well, how do we start figuring out what are the right things to work on and the wrong things to work on? And the best way that we know to do that is to test the market with smaller experiments faster, right? How can we start optimizing here? What we want to optimize is more product learning over just a delivery mindset. So most organizations are taking more of an execution focus and saying, you know what, our job is we've got 100 features we got to get done this year. How do we optimize to get those 100 features done? Well, what if we said 64% of those features are the wrong features? So now in Adapt, we start looking at things like, build, measure, learn, and say, how do we start optimizing this experiment loop, and how do we start implementing things down at the development level, like experiment-driven development, where we're building small experiments, getting them in front of the customers and learning from those, and then that objective data is what's feeding into our next priorities in our backlog. So that starts changing dynamics across the organization, and we start getting into things like business agility. So how is this going to impact marketing? How's it going to impact finance, right? Instead of having big budget cycles, where we're going to, all right, you get $3 million and go spend it, what we're going to say is, well, what if we just gave you $100,000 and at the end of the month you had to come back and prove with objective data and the experiments that you run that you should get another $100,000? Or what is your recommendation? Should we spend more, less, the same amount? What are we learning, and what should we do going forward? Which really gets our teams very customer focused and very in tune with what are they delivering and very close with their customers versus just kind of having this execution focus. So if we kind of look at this, it's the reason why we built it out in this way is to say, we can't be adaptable in terms of the market if we're not able to release things quickly into the market, right? So now that we're able to deliver things quickly, we can then respond quickly based on what the market's telling us. So adapt builds on accelerate. And we said we can't really deliver fast if we can't be predictable. And we can't be predictable if the team's not taking ownership of trying to get better and better. And we're never going to get everybody through that pain if we're not aligned around the mission. So if we just kind of back through the path to agility. So at the end of the day, going back up to our J curve here, our change curve, remember what we really think that the value that Agile Velocity brings to help you through this path to agility is what we're really focused on is how do we accelerate and support and guide you through this learning curve, and how do we reduce the risk that could happen if you try and kind of just figure it all out on your own. So hopefully this is helpful to you to kind of guide you through, and you can kind of see where you think you fit on this path to agility. And if you'd like to talk more about it, my name is David Hawks. I'm with Agile Velocity, and I would love to chat. Thanks.